right, this is Unit 8, and we're talking about graphing quadratics, which is the very first section. So a quadratic equation, first of all, just to remind you, is anything that has an x squared in it. That would make it a quadratic equation. Remember, if you have an x squared, you would have two answers for this equation. But we're going to be graphing it today. So one way to graph, if you don't know what something looks like, is simply to make an XY table. So if I pick values for X and put them in here, I can solve for values of Y. Well, if I pick 0, well, 0 squared is 0. I could pick 1. Well, 1 squared would be 1. I could pick 2. Well, 2 times 2 would be 4. But I also need to consider negative numbers. So if I plugged in -1 times -1 would be a positive 1. And if I plugged in -2 times -2 would be a positive 4. So if I graphed this particular equation, I have 0, 0. I should put arrows on the end of my graph. I'll have 0, 0, which would be right there. 1, 1, so I'm going to go over 1, up 1. 2, 4, so I'm going to go over 2, up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'm going to have -1, positive 1, so -1, positive 1, and -2, positive 4. So you can see my quadratic equation is always going to graph as some sort of a u function. Please make sure that you always round this. Don't make it straight like this, because then that would be an absolute value function. So make sure you're rounded here at the bottom. So we're going to actually use this pattern of over 1, up 1, over 2, up 4 in order to graph all of the functions that we have. So we have something called vertex form of a quadratic equation, and it looks something like this. Y equals h minus h squared plus k. And this is going to be the basic pattern for basically all the equations that you're going to be graphing in your future math life. Next to the x, it's always going to be a minus sign. So it's always going to be the opposite sign of what's next to the x. And then out here you have this plus k, and that will still say plus k. This negative h here is going to be what they call your horizontal shift. And that's going to move your vertex left or right. And this k over here is called your vertical shift. And that's going to move your vertex up and down. And I guess I didn't really clarify what is a vertex. When you have this graph here, remember, that's a horrible graph. Let's try that again. When you have this graph here, when I went to 0, 0, 1, 1, negative 1, 1, 2, 4, when I have a graph that looks like this point here where it changes direction, it goes from going up on this side and then going up on this side, this point here is called your vertex. And this point will shift left or right or up and down based on those values. So let's take a look at an example. If I have y equals x minus 3 squared plus 1. So now this is your horizontal shift. Remember, it's always the opposite sign. So that means your horizontal shift is going to be plus 3. So it's going to go in that direction. And this here is your vertical shift, and that stays the same sign. So that's going to go up 1. So what you do here when you're going to graph this is, again, you draw your graph. But now, instead of starting at 0, 0, I'm going to go over 3, 1, 2, 3, and up 1. So it's as if I've taken my vertex from this point and I've picked it up and I've put it down here. From this point, I can use my pattern now. If you remember, the pattern was over 1, up 1. So from this point, I'm going to go over 1, up 1. So that'll be my next point. And then the next pattern is over 2, up 4. So here from this point, you're always going to go back to your vertex. I'm going to go over 2, up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you just reflect those on the other side because your parabola, that shape, that U shape is called a parabola. Your parabola will always be symmetrical. So it'll be like a mirror. On this side, it'll be the same as on this side. So here I'm 1 away from, like this would be my center line. I'm 1 away from my center line, so I'm going to go 1 in the opposite direction. Here I'm 2 away from my center line, so I'll go 2 in the opposite direction. And then here I can just graph this. So you can see this graph is exactly the same as if I had it down here, and if I could just pluck it up and put it down there, it would be the same curve. This middle line here is actually called your axis of symmetry. Axis of symmetry. So this axis of symmetry is always going to be an x value. So this is going to be x equals, well, in this case, my x value is 3. So my axis of symmetry is x equals 3. Let's go ahead and do another one. Let's see. If I had y equals x plus 4 squared plus 1. So here, now, remember, it's always the opposite sign. So now here, my horizontal shift is going to be to the left 4. My vertical shift will still be up 1. So if I draw my coordinate plane here, I'm going to start by plotting my vertex. So from 0, 0, I'm going to go over 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 1. Now that I've moved my vertex from this point, I'm going to graph my pattern. My pattern is over 1, up 1. From this point, I'm going to go over 2, up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to reflect these points on the other side. So from here, I'm going to go over into the negative 1, up 1. Here, I'm going to go over negative 2, up 4. And then I'm going to connect my points, making sure I have a nice curve at the bottom, not a point. So that's how you're going to graph these. Now, sometimes they'll just ask you to state the vertex. So if we have something like this, and I said, what is the vertex? Well, this here is going to be your horizontal shift, and it's always the opposite sign. So your vertex will be negative 2, negative 3. If there was nothing there, if it was just x plus 2 squared like this, well, there's nothing there, so you can assume, well, that's sort of like saying plus 0. So now my vertex would be negative 2, 0. By the same token, if I had y equals x, well, I guess I don't really need parentheses now, x squared minus 5, well, I have nothing next to my x in my parentheses. So it's sort of like the same thing as saying x minus 0 squared minus 5. So now you know your vertex here would be 0, negative 5. And if I had y equals x plus 4 squared minus 3, you could just say your vertex was minus 4, minus 3. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.